Appreciate it. Great. Once again, the House entertains shrinking the legislature. This has been something that's been very important to me. I ran on this concept 9 years ago. Overwhelmingly, across this state, we've polled it so many times, the people of Pennsylvania overwhelmingly support it. I voted for this bill 5 times now. And here, hopefully we're going to get a chance to put it over the goal line today. It's important to examine this subject objectively, and I'm going to lay out some of those arguments, because Pennsylvania operates the largest full-time legislature in the country. The second largest legislature behind New Hampshire's 424 seat, but theirs is a part-time legislature. Ours is the largest full-time legislature in the country. That should be enough. That statement, enough, is alone ringing in the ears of our constituents back home. That's what they say every time I go around. There are too many politicians in Harrisburg, and they're right. There are too many. And I'm going to lay out why I think it should be smaller. I visited 14 state legislatures since I've been in office in the last 8 years to study the various systems out there. And I've spent a lot of time talking to legislators in other states. And it's through that lens of comparison that we can see the blemishes of our own system and why it needs to be corrected. So let's take a look at a few other legislatures. Our neighbor in Ohio, which is nearly equivalent in population, and it's a rural state, governs with a 99-member state house. 99 members to our 203. They each represent roughly 120,000 residents per representative. So a smaller legislature is not impossible for a state our size. I visited that legislature and observed how it functioned. There is much less chaos and much more robust debate, actual debate there on the floor of the House. Most constituents, and I know the media, they're familiar with this because they're there every day, when they visit our assembly, they immediately notice the chaos on the floor and how few people even seem to be paying attention to the speakers as they're speaking. There's really little debate. People are off doing other things. They're really not listening. When you go to Ohio, it's very polite. Each member seems to be listening. They get called on one at a time. They listen to each other. There's actual debate on the floor because there are fewer members there. 99 members. We can also examine Illinois, the 5th largest state in population, just ahead of us. Slightly larger in size. It also functions effectively with only 118 representatives. You may remember I invited one senator from that great state here to speak to us on the 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. He happens to occupy Abraham Lincoln's old seat there, and he came and spoke at our ceremony then. And then there's New York, the 3rd largest in population and slightly larger than us in size. They operate their House with 150 representatives and 62 senators. Again, the 3rd, 5th, we're the 6th, the 7th. All the states near us in population and size operate with a much smaller legislature. My rural colleagues say that a smaller legislature will hurt the rural districts. And I would offer even one more compelling example to dispute that, and that would be Montana. Montana is an appropriate example of the rural-urban argument. Montana is the 4th largest state geographically, 147,000 square miles, just under 1 million people in 56 counties. A quarter of its population is in 4 cities concentrated there. They function effectively with 100 representatives and 50 senators, and they're a part-time legislature. I visited that legislature and talked with senators and representatives. They feel rural Montana is well represented with fewer members. Other colleagues contend that Pennsylvania is a diverse state, and we are. But it's interesting that when you talk to reps in other states, they also argue that their state is uniquely diverse. Ohio is a rural state with concentrated populations in large urban areas such as Cleveland and Cincinnati. Illinois is a rural state with a large concentration in Chicago and surrounding counties, yet both operate effectively with a smaller legislature. Now, some colleagues say we should have a larger legislature. They actually say that. Some are out there thinking we should have more. Larger is better, they say. Voice of the people. We need more legislators. But when you go up to New Hampshire with that 424-member assembly, you see that each legislator there has a smaller voice. More power is shifted to leadership there to run such a large bureaucracy. And individual legislators are neutral, and I think neutered, and each one of those is, I think, represents around 5,000 people. Others argue that a larger legislature cuts down on corruption and is difficult for lobbyists to influence a larger number of legislators. In fact, the opposite is true. A larger assembly places the power in the hands of a few leaders, so lobbyists need only influence those leaders to get their way. I also want to briefly address here the idea of a part-time legislature, which I'm not opposed to. We don't address that in this bill, but I think it relates to what we're doing here with the size of the legislature. I want to use Texas as an example, because Texas provides some inspiration in this regard. It carries the title of our second largest state in both size and population, but it's a part-time legislature. Consider that a state nearly 6 times the size of Pennsylvania and 2.2 times the population rules with a mere 150 House members compared to our 203. And they meet every other year for 3 months and pass a 2-year budget. And they have the reputation of getting things done in Texas. So if a state that big can do it successfully, we might want to study how Texas can pull that off. PA was a part-time legislature at one time, and I just want to remind you there are trade-offs for that. We're not talking about that today. But under a part-time legislature, more power rests in the governor. I don't think, especially right now, we want to give more power to the governor. Our state has an active legislature that represents the people directly and is a strong counterbalance to the executive and the bloated bureaucracy. Finally, at least a few colleagues tout the fact that the number we represent is small enough that we can personally touch each constituent. I agree. And I have knocked on nearly 40,000 doors in the last 4 elections. My wife and I routinely attend over 200 local events a year in our district. But under this bill, our districts will become only slightly larger and will remain a size reachable by the representative willing to work it. Around 80-some thousand is what we would represent, as opposed to 63,000. Still less than Ohio's, remember. What is the optimal number for our state? There's nothing magical about the number of 203. We know from the briefings we had here a couple years ago that number's arbitrary. It just came up. There was no thought really given to that number. We can safely say an effective number lies somewhere between 100 and 175 members for a state our size. We can learn from Ohio. We can learn from New York and Illinois and other states, but we don't have to be them. That's why we have a good compromise bill here, reducing the size of the legislature to 151 members, which, looking at it objectively, is much more reasonable than the 203 we have right now. We can set our own standards within those guidelines. And that makes the proposed number of 151 a reasonable number, as I said, for a state our size. Still others argue, well, not much money will be saved. And that's relatively true. It's not all about the money. We'll likely save in the tens of millions, not hundreds of millions. And some say, well, if we have a bigger districts, we'll just have more district offices and the amount will go up. We don't necessarily have to do that. These other states that are part-time legislatures and are smaller than us, they don't even have district offices. Some of them don't even have offices in the capital. There's no reason why we need to expand our district offices just because we reduce the size of our districts. The larger argument is about effectiveness, not just cost savings. And some argue that it's not the legislature, but the bureaucracy that needs reducing. I agree, 100%. But it's not an either-or argument. We can work on both, but we also need to reduce our legislature. In the end, the people desire a smaller legislature, and there is sound justification that our legislature is just too large. Remember, this legislation must pass the House and Senate in 2 different sessions, and we're almost there. We're at the last step of this process. To hold it up now and not vote it when we're this close to letting the people have their say would be unconscionable at this point. The people want this, but they don't believe we'll do it. I hear about back home all the time. They always say, you'll never vote yourselves out of a job. You politicians up there, you don't want to vote yourselves out of a job. And I always tell them, I've voted 5 times now to vote myself out of a job. But there's still opposition to it here. It's time we do what the people want. We need to bring this bill up today. We need to vote it and get it on the ballot for the people to decide. Thank you very much.